everybody, my name's James Rinto, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make a Hungarian dish called Székelykáposzta. Székelykáposzta is a pork and sauerkraut stew. It's probably something similar to what Americans would know as goulash, but as we go through this recipe, I'll be explaining you some of the differences between what Hungarians actually do call goulash or gulyás, a porkolt, which is a stew, and paprikash, which is of course similar to the famous Ohio dish chicken paprikash. One of the great things about Hungarian cooking is that there are a few basic ingredients. Once you have those basic ingredients, you can change the type of meat you're using, you can change the amount of liquid in the recipe, and actually make quite a few different recipes just using the same basic ingredients with a few sub-ins. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. A little bit of history behind this dish. Székelykáposzta means Székely cabbage. Székely was a Hungarian author, a poet, a journalist that lived in the 19th century. And like many origin stories for dishes, you know, think buffalo chicken wings, the story behind Székelykáposzta, we don't know if it's true or not, but the story behind Székelykáposzta is that József Székely went to a restaurant in Budapest. Actually, the Pest was called Pest at that time. And he was there late. There wasn't a lot of food left, but there was a little bit of pork stew left and a little bit of sauteed sauerkraut left. And so he told the owner of the restaurant to just kind of throw it all together. And he liked it so much, the next time he came, he ordered the same thing. And because he was a famous author and journalist, they actually named it after him. Now, there are other origin stories to that. Sometimes it's also called Szegedin goulash, which is after the city of Szeged. Although, to my knowledge, it does not come from Szeged, but more to that later. So let's get started and let me show you some of the ingredients. Okay, so there are four great things that make Székelykáposzta a wonderful recipe for you to make. Number one is the fact that it is very easy to make. It is somewhat time consuming when it comes to cook time, but the actual amount of prep time and the different techniques that you're going to use are very easy, very self-explanatory, and can be done by anybody with any sort of basic cooking skills. So, number two, it is a cheap recipe. There are no ingredients here that are particularly expensive. And so you can make a large quantity of food for people for a relatively low price. So that's great. Number three, there are not really any specialty ingredients. I am using two specialty ingredients in my recipe, and if you could find those, great. But if not, they can easily be subbed out for things that are more easy to find in a store right here in Medina County. And finally, it's delicious, which is always the prerequisite for any good recipe. So let's talk about the ingredients. As I said before, Székelykáposzta is a pork and sauerkraut stew. So of course, two of your main ingredients are going to be pork and sauerkraut. For pork, I'm using 2 pounds of pork shoulder. Pork shoulder is a great meat to use in stews. It's a tougher meat, so it needs to cook for longer. We're going to cook this for a really long time, so it's perfect. And it's also fatty enough. You want to have a fattier cut of meat for this because number one, that's going to add a lot of flavor to the dish, and number two, that's going to help to thicken the stew. The sauerkraut, just a jar of regular sauerkraut. This is a 32-ounce jar. You can use whatever kind of sauerkraut you want. I will talk more about the sauerkraut later. Of course, you're going to need paprika. Any good Hungarian recipe that's not a dessert is probably going to include at least some paprika. I will also talk more about paprika later and some of the history of that and the stuff behind that. This is another specialty ingredient that I have. This is double smoked bacon. You can get this probably at some butcher shops or at markets that specialize in Eastern European food. One of the great things about double smoked bacon is it'll add some smokiness and some additional fattiness to the meal. You can also eat it just as is, which I will show you later. For seasoning and other things of that nature, we have a large onion. We will be using a few cloves of garlic. Garlic is optional. Most recipes, I would say, for Székely-káposzta might not include garlic, but I love garlic, and I did see a few recipes that had it, and so I'm going to add some. You need 2 bay leaves. You need freshly ground black pepper. You need salt. You need some vegetable oil for cooking the dish. Traditionally, Hungarians would use lard to cook lots of stews like this, but I'm just going to use vegetable oil. And then finally, you will need some sour cream to put on top at the end. So through the miracle of modern technology, I've already diced the 1 large onion into kind of rough dices. You don't need to be too precise because it's going to disappear eventually anyway. Besides, I'm a bad onion cutter, so I didn't want to embarrass myself. In the bottom of a large pot, I have put a little layer of vegetable oil. Again, if you want to be more traditional, you can use lard, but since I'm using double smoked bacon, I think that'll probably be plenty of fat. So, this is one of the keys to Hungarian cooking, which is the slow sautéing of onion. When I started to learn to cook Hungarian food, I was surprised by how many recipes actually begin with sautéing an onion over a medium-low heat in oil. And so what you're going to do, this is kind of the most tedious part of this process. You're going to salt the onions a bit. You're going to have it at a medium-low heat, and you are going to stir and stir and stir. Now, what you are looking for, you do not want the onions to burn, obviously, but you also don't want them to caramelize. A lot of recipes call for caramelized onions. That is not what you want. What you're looking for is a translucent onion and an onion that basically is very soft but not caramelized. Now, this process should take at least 10 minutes. Probably closer to 15, but trust me, it's worth it. What you are doing by doing this with the onions is you are basically creating a flavor base. The combination of whatever fat you're using, whether it's oil or lard, and the onions is going to be the foundation for the entire dish. So, take your time, put on some nice music, and slowly simmer these onions in the oil for about 10 minutes, stirring from time to time. Now, just so we can multitask in the kitchen, I'm going to cut up the meat while we're waiting for the onions to simmer down. Do not keep your eye off the onions for too long. You definitely do not want them to burn or caramelize. So just kind of reduce that, maybe make sure it's on at least a medium-low heat. Stir it occasionally, but we can do 2 things at the same time. So this nice big piece of pork shoulder, you are just going to cut this into some rough chunks, kind of bite-sized chunks for a nice big bite. Now, if you want to cheat, you can definitely go to the store and buy what's called stew meat, pork stew meat. That will work as well. However, what I have read is that the pork stew meat is usually kind of the lower quality meat. Not that it's bad, but it's just not necessarily the best meat. And so I like to take a nice big piece of pork shoulder like this. It's not very expensive. And as I said, you're just going to cut it into chunks about that big. Now you might ask me, James, can you do this recipe with another kind of meat? And the answer is, well, there are many related recipes that you can do, but it would not be Székely-káposzta. So if you want to make this recipe specifically, you need to have pork, but there are many related dishes that you can use. All right, I'm going to continue cubing this. I'm going to make sure that I keep an eye on my onions and that they're cooking down and becoming nice and translucent. As I said, about 10 minutes. And I will talk to you again once the onions are done. So this has been about 10-12 minutes of me slowly sauteing these onions. You can see the quality of the onion here. It's translucent, it hasn't burned, it hasn't caramelized, but what it's done is released all of those onion flavors into the oil. which, as I said, is going to be kind of the formation of our flavor profile. Next thing I'm going to add is the double smoked bacon. One of the great things about double smoked bacon is that you can just eat it. Looks disgusting, looks like I'm eating raw bacon. I'm not. It's double smoked, which means it's already edible. Again, this is an optional thing, but when you have a chance to add bacon, you should definitely add it. I'm only adding this for a couple of minutes, just to release some of those nice smoky flavors into the onion mix, release a little more fat. Okay, we're going to let that go for a little bit longer, and then we are going to do the next very essential step of this recipe. So I've let the nice fatty smoky flavors of the smoked bacon go into our onion and oil mix. Now for a very, very essential step. Let me move my pile of meat here. We are going to take the pot off the heat and add the paprika. Now this is essential. If you add the paprika into the pot while it's still on there, while it's still cooking, it might very well burn, it'll become bitter, it'll change color, it'll make your dish very, well, just not good. So the paprika, I want to tell you a little bit about paprika and the history of paprika. Paprika is basically ground chili peppers, and it came to Hungary via the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. Large parts of Hungary were controlled by the Ottoman Turks. The Turks, who controlled a huge area of land in Europe and Asia and Africa at that time, traded with the Spanish in the Mediterranean, and the Spanish had, of course, brought the chili pepper over from Mexico and from their colonies in the New World. And so paprika entered Hungary through Turkey and up into the Balkans, and within a short amount of time it became a very essential part of Hungarian cuisine. But it's hard to imagine now for people who enjoy Hungarian food. 500 years ago there was no paprika in Hungary because there were no peppers anywhere in the old world. Now the paprika that I'm using, if I can brag a little bit, it is directly from Hungary. I bought it at a Hungarian import store, but you can definitely use paprika just that you get at the store. However, do not use smoked paprika. What you're going to want to find is what's called sweet paprika, or just something that's labeled paprika. Now, this is another variation that I add because it's my personal recipe. I am using csipuş paprika, which means spicy. Traditionally, Székely goulash would not use spicy paprika. It would use regular paprika, but I enjoy it, and so I like to make this dish a little bit on the spicy side. I am adding 2 tablespoons of the spicy paprika. And as I said, very important, it is off the heat. This way I am infusing all of that beautiful, fatty, oily, oniony mixture with all that nice, peppery, spicy paprika. And so what I've done here is I've created kind of almost like a paste, a paprika, oil, onion, bacon paste. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of Hungarian dishes have the same basic foundation. This foundation, minus the bacon, but the foundation of oil, onion, and paprika is how you make chicken paprikash, which is essentially the same combination, cooked with chicken and then with sour cream added at the end. And it's also how you make porkholt, which is sort of the standard Hungarian stew, which is what we would call goulash. And it's how you make what the Hungarians call goulash, which is actually a soup, gulyás leves, made with beef. So that foundation, oil, sauteed onions, paprika, you can use that to make any number of Hungarian dishes. But today we're doing Székely-káposzta. Okay, now I'm going to add my pork shoulder. As you see, I've cut it into sort of bite-sized chunks. I'm just going to put it directly into the pot. Now, some people might want to brown it, but I personally think that that's not the most necessary step. You don't need the bone. I've removed just a little bit of excess fat, kind of that tougher fat that you get on meat sometimes. And I've removed this little bone, so you don't want that stuff. But in general, you do not want to remove the fat. Now, before I put it back on the heat, I'm going to stir that stuff in there nice and good. I'm going to season with a little bit of salt. You probably don't need too much salt because you have the smoked, the double smoked bacon in there. A little bit of freshly ground pepper. I'm going to put this back on the heat. I'm going to turn it up to high, and I am going to cover it with water. How much water you use is just dependent on how much you have. But you want it to be about like that, just covering the meat. Okay, so we have this now close to a rolling boil. You can see all of that nice fat is mixing with the paprika. Pork is already starting to change color. And now the easy part. Reduce your heat to low. Put on your lid. And you're going to let that cook for about an hour. So we're ready to do the next step, which is to drain and rinse the sauerkraut. Now generally, when sauerkraut is used by Americans, I think, like to put on top of a hot dog or whatever, it's usually just kind of used as is out of the jar. However, for a recipe like this, you definitely want to rinse and squeeze it out. The reason is, if you put the sauerkraut in there kind of as is, the dish will probably be too sour and too salty. So what I'm going to do is rinse this in some cold water and just kind of wring it out with my hands. Just for about maybe 30 seconds. Just rinse, mix it like that. And then I'm going to kind of press out the extra moisture. Now, you could do it for longer. I, of course, like to have a little more sourness in the dish, but you can definitely do it for longer if you want to take out even more of that kind of sour, briny taste. Okay, let's take a look. It's looking nice right now. As I said, I tried the pork a few minutes ago. It seemed like it was really pretty much ready for the next step. The next step being, I'm going to add 4 cloves of garlic. Again, this is an optional step. I would say probably the majority of recipes I saw did not call for garlic, but a few definitely did. I like garlic. So we're just going to add 4 cloves of minced garlic in there. We're going to add our 2 bay leaves. If you think that it needs additional salt or pepper, you can taste it and add it this time. Mine's pretty good. Another optional and actually probably more common seasoning is caraway seeds. I personally do not like caraway seeds very much, so I've omitted them, but if you want to add caraway seeds, that's fine. And then finally, our rinsed and drained sauerkraut. Give that a nice stir. If you are unhappy with the level of liquid, you can always add a little bit more, but I think we're really good right here. I'm going to put my lid back on, and I'm going to cook it for another half an hour, and then we will be done. Okay, while we're finishing waiting for this to cook, we have about 15 minutes left. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why should you listen to me. in learning to cook Hungarian food? Well, let me start up by saying I'm not a Hungarian, not an ethnic Hungarian at all. I am various European ethnicities, Finnish, Irish, German, Greek, but not Hungarian. So I don't have a Hungarian grandmother to fall back on who used to bring me into the kitchen when I was a little kid and show me how to cook this stuff. I did, however, live in Transylvania, which is a region of Romania, as an English teacher, where there are a lot of ethnic Hungarians. I belonged to Hungary for a long time, and Transylvanian food is sort of a combination of Hungarian and Romanian food. I also taught for a little while in Hungary itself, and that's where I learned to cook these dishes. I sort of had a lot of free time and had access to all the ingredients, and so I said, wow, I'm going to learn to do all of these dishes that I was having friends prepare for me or eating in restaurants. When I came back to Ohio after teaching there, I really wanted to continue cooking this type of food and sharing it with friends of mine back home. The good news is you do not have to be a Hungarian, nor do you have to live in Hungary to be able to prepare this kind of food, especially in northeastern Ohio. Northeastern Ohio is an area with tons and tons of Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians, who came over here usually about 100 years ago during the second big wave of immigration to the United States. And actually at one time Cleveland, Ohio had the second largest Hungarian population in the world after Budapest. So you can find Hungarian restaurants in Cleveland. You can go to the West Side Market and go to Hungarian specialty stores. But as I said, you don't need to go to those places to make something like this. All the ingredients can be found at a regular grocery store. And you certainly don't need to have lived over there or be from that group to be able to learn to cook this food. That's my personal philosophy with any food. I think that if you look at a food, if you study some of the recipes, try to find some of the recipes from the actual country, just do a Google Translate. That's how I put this recipe together. I found a bunch of Hungarian recipes. I Google translated them. I kind of mixed it together to see which way I thought would taste the best. And so hopefully in 12 minutes we'll see if that result was good. Okay, it's been about a half an hour with the sauerkraut in. Let's take a look. Now you can see the pork should be very tender. The juices should have mixed with all of the seasoning. That looks pretty good. Let's turn off our heat. And we're going to let that rest for just a little bit, a few minutes before we serve it because it's quite hot. And we're going to find out how it tastes. All right, get a nice big portion. Now you might ask if there's something that you can serve this with. I think the most typical thing in Hungary would be with a nice piece of like crusty bread. You could make spätzle, like homemade little small dumplings. You could serve it with egg noodles. I suppose you could probably serve it with rice. Personally, I just like it this way. Essential, sour cream. Just like paprika is very, very common in a lot of Hungarian cuisine, also sour cream. I would just put a nice big dollop on top. See how it tastes. That is truly good. The pork is very, very tender. Really, I mean, it just melts in your mouth. The fattiness from the bacon adds that kind of little smoky character. It is, you know, pretty spicy. Again, I think a more normal recipe would use just regular paprika. But if you like to have a little bit of spice, you can use the spicy. In fact, you could probably even maybe do a tablespoon of spicy and a tablespoon of sweet paprika, whichever way you'd like to do it. But that really is a very good recipe. It's hearty, it's meaty, it's just good. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning to make Székely-káposzta. Again, my name is James Rinto, and jó étvágyat!